Care to introduce yourself?
All right, my name is Mark Z. Brandon, Jr. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, October the 4th, 1904. My father was Mark Z. Brandon, Sr. He was born in 1872, and he passed away in 1954. In Savannah, Georgia, he married my mother, Elizabeth Hampson Tedder. And my mother was born in 1880, and she passed away in 1965. When I was a year old, we moved to Callahan, Florida. At that time, I remember one of the things that I had to do to establish my age was, since there wasn't a diary or anything kept on us, I remember my folks breaking me up early in the morning and telling me to come and look up the skies. It was Halley's Comet. Well, I know that Halley's Comet was there in 1910, so I knew exactly how old I was. Anyway, the family moved to Brandon in 1912. And since there were two Marks, the community called me Little Mark, and they called my father Big Mark. And anybody, up until I was 21, 22 years old, I still had, they said, well, get Little Mark to come over, or get Big Mark, one or the other. That's the way it went.
Mark, tell us who your grandfather was.
My grandfather was John Brandon, the founder of the town of Brandon. And he passed away when my father was 12 years old. So what information I know about him and my father's mother, we got from books and things, and also from tales that they would tell.
And your father's mother was named?
My father's mother was named Victoria. Well, let's see, she had two names. First, it was Martha Carson Brown. That's her first marriage. That's when she married John Brandon before they came from Mississippi on the trip to Florida. Her second marriage was Victoria Marie Seward Barn Brandon Sherrill, in that order.
But Victoria was your grandmother.
Victoria was my grandmother.
Okay.
And when John Brandon returned to Brandon after having left here and at the death of his first wife, Martha, he built her a home. And then they would have lived in the home about, I guess, 5 or 6 years, and then he passed away, of course, and then left with Victoria.
Tell us how John Brandon came down here and where he came from.
Well, he came from Mississippi.
What was the year, do you know?
Yes. Let me look at something here just a minute. About January of 57. That's the date that they arrived here.
1857.
57. Now, there wasn't anything here, but just a wilderness like. So they went to Fort Brooke. That was a military establishment, what's now known as Tampa. It was in the Tampa Bay area.
How did he travel from Mississippi, John?
A big caravan. He brought his wife, 3 sons. There was oxen, horses, and several wagons. And my grandfather was apparently, that's John, was a man, a jack of all trades, you might say. He had to be a millwright because he had to build the wagons, and he had to, just do anything that came about in those days. So they came here, and they also brought their slaves with them. It took them about 2 years to get here.
From
And they came from Mississippi. He married his wife, his first wife, Martha Brown Carson, in Tennessee. But they only lived there about a year. They moved to Mississippi. And then that's where the family emanated from, right from Mississippi.
Do you know why he decided to come to Florida?
Wanderlust, they say. I guess that's about what you could call it. Anyway, they had moved around a bit. He didn't seem like to stay in one place very long. But although books that have been written about the family, and I have one here that's called The Brandon Family of Southwest Florida, and other books, didn't tell exactly the true story. First, he sent his son down here. This is by word of mouth now. It's not in the books, but this is by word of mouth. He sent his son down here first, and he was 2 years getting down here and getting back to tell his father, John, that what a nice place it was and everything. So then they decided they would come down here, and they arrived. They arrived, as I just mentioned, in 1857 at Fort Brooke. And then they came out in this area, which was not where we are now, not where Brandon is known now, but north of here, in the Sefna area. And that's and where there's a New Hope Cemetery here in Brandon. And it was over in that area that they first settled. Then, as I mentioned earlier, when his wife passed away, that's Martha, then he went to Fort Meade. While he was there, he had known, let me go back just a little bit, in Mississippi, there were some other families there. There were the Stewards there, and they knew each other. But here's John coming from Mississippi down to Florida, and later on the Stewards, in the meantime, Maurice Seward married a person by the name of Arn, and they came south, but they landed over at Fort Meade. So when John Brandon's wife, Martha, died, and he went to Fort Meade, he left all of his holdings in possession of James Henry Brandon. That's the fellow that built the home that's now the Stowers Funeral Home. He left everything with James Henry and went to Fort Meade for some unknown reason, established a little community there. All right, shortly before that, unbeknownst to either family, the Brandons or the Barnes, Josiah Barnes was killed in the Battle of the Mississippi Ridge. And Victoria Marie Seward Barnes was a widow there and available. So they were married. And then he returned from Fort Meade about 1874.
Returned to Brandon.
Returned to Brandon about 1874.
What at the time was called, at the time?
1874 was just a community. It was actually, I think, called New Hope.
Mm-hmm.
That was really in this little chart over here, and other information that I'm telling you about. There's no person living today that knows more about the early days of Brandon. Now I'm talking about the real early days, just as I'm describing to you now, like 1874 and things. Then Paul Dennis and Betty Dennis. Paul was very much interested in when the Methodist Church was founded and all like that. And they did an enormous amount of legwork. And he wrote this book here about the early days of New Hope Church. And a lot of the information that we get was from there also.
Tell us what you were told Brandon was like, or New Hope was like at that time. Describe it a little.
Yes.
From what you were told.
Of course, I'll have to do it from memory from the book. That's the only thing I can gather on and from reading here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a church there, and there was it was made out of logs, wooden floor. My two cousins, Martha and Mary Brandon, who was the children of Isaac Brandon. John Brandon was also their grandfather, of course. But John Brandon and Mark Brandon and Isaac Brandon were my brothers. They were half brothers, really. But they described the old days as going to church in this little church over at that they built out of log cabins, and that was That was a little bit northeast of where the present New Hope Cemetery is, that John Brandon provided for the people for the townspeople to.
John Brandon provided the
yes.
church.
And then they started the church. About 9 months ago, I came into possession of a little Bible that had been used in that church, in which John Brandon had given to a member of that church. And I didn't see any reason why I should keep it, because it was really in the Methodist church. So I presented it to the Methodist church one Sunday. But they described, getting back to what it was like, they described going to church, that's about the size of it, and they said it was full of fleas. They have to stop and scratch fleas, things like that. And of course, it's hard for us, it's hard for me to get a picture of what it was like then, because now there's no trees or anything about it. This was an enormous forest. It was completely covered with trees and was virgin territory, and it just was, it's hard. Right now, when I go down to the corner of Moon and Victoria Street and stand there, that was once the hub of Brandon. Every single thing was there. There is absolutely nothing there, nothing.
Tell us what was at this corner of Moon and Victoria.
Well, I can do it two ways. I can describe it the best I can, or I can point it out to you
Okay.
on a map. Either way, on a little thing that I have.
Okay.
Either way that you like.
Why don't you go ahead and describe it? Tell us what it was like.
All right. In the very beginning, like over here, Dan Galvin was the first person to have a store in Brandon. Now, he had there was another settlement down in Bloomingdale area, a large settlement, and Dan Galvin had a store there. But when the railroad came through, he apparently realized that that was going to be, there'd be more trade there, so he moved the store from what did I say?
Bloomingdale.
From Bloomingdale up to Brandon. Then there was the railroad station there. My father was the second railroad agent in Brandon. Well, incidentally, going back to my father, he was, let me digress a little bit, he was a station agent in Callahan, Florida for the Seaboard and Coastline Railroads. And he was sent to Savannah, but I'm getting a little bit off. He was sent to Savannah by his mother to go to college, and he went to college and got a business administration education, something we corresponded what we have today like that. It was a business thing. And then he went to school at nights, learning about the internal combustion engine. They even had models. They had engines that would run, and you could go to school. It was like a trade school, tear the engine down and rebuild it, see what made it tick, things like that. Then Victoria, when she was a widow, she took a real active part in the community, as I know, because, see, I lived with her, my father, my mother, from 1912. That's when we arrived in Brandon from Callahan, Florida, in 1912, at the request of his mother. At that time, her health was poor, very poor. And she said, one Sunday she called most of the sons together, and there was 5 of them at that time, and said, I don't think I can make it anymore on my own. That's the bottom line. If any one of you will come and live with me, I'll give you whatever I have. And all of the land, then, it was left by John Brandon. He left quite a bit, acreage, I'd say maybe 250 acres, passed into Victoria's hands, and then eventually passed into my father's hands. So
So you and your mother and father went to live with Victoria?
we went to take care of her,
Mhm.
and we lived there until her death, excepting for 2 years when when the Curtiss Airplane Factory in Buffalo, New York, asked my father to come up during World War I, help them on a project there. We moved to Buffalo, New York, but outside of that year and a half or 2 years, we were there from 1912 until her death in December of 1926. That's when she passed away. But getting back to the Dan Galvin store.
And what did they sell at Dan Galvin's store?
All right, they sold some groceries, they sold kerosene, They sold feed, and a couple of years later, you could get a haircut there.
Just about everything you wanted, huh?
Sure. I'll tell a little
Was it-
story on myself. My grandmother sent me to the store one time with a bottle to buy some kerosene. On the way there, it was only 200 paces, but believe me, this was a journey for me to go in through all these woods and everything. But I stopped halfway down to play in some old crates and things. It was a packing house, orange packing house. And now nobody knows that there was a packing house, orange packing house right in the center of Brandon. People don't know that, see. On the way to the store, excuse me, when I got there, I couldn't remember what I went for. They told me, they tell this on me. I said I gave it to Jim Morgan and said, smell the bottle and give me a quart. But that's what you could get there, and that was about it. But
So all the lamps in your grandmother's house was lit with kerosene?
no, yes, but she cooked with it. That's what she cooked with.
Uh-huh.
Until later on, when my father moved from Callahan to Brandon, he had his own electric light plant. And he set it up in Brandon, and we had the house wired. And it ran from 7 till 9 at night, 2 hours a day. That's when the lights were. And people came from all around, believe me. There were people here, and they would see an electric light. And
So you were the only ones that had an electric light?
we were the
in
first people that I know of who had an electric light plant of their own here in Brandon. Later on, we got electricity here, but we had to buy the telephones. I mean the poles to put the lights up. They came from Plant City, and if you wanted they would come up to a certain point, and then if you wanted, like we had to buy 3 of those telephone poles at $10 each to have them put up to get the line strung from the main point of origin into the house. This was later, say, probably 1916 or 17. But at the beginning, when we came here, that's how we had lights like that.
And you were just a young boy at that time.
Yes, I was 8 years old when I arrived here, excuse me, in 1912.
Tell us what you did as a young boy for entertainment.
Wasn't any. we worked pretty regularly. There wasn't anybody here. See, eventually I had cousins and my father's brothers moved in here, and on Sundays we would gather around my grandmother's home, and maybe there'd be 4 or 5 of us. It seems real silly, but to say this, but on Sunday afternoons what we would do was to get a bottle, and that was a real trinket for us to get a glass bottle, like soda's made in today or something like that. And we'd tie a string on it, and we'd go in the sand, and we'd push this thing around, and we'd make railroads out of that, and sidings and switches, and we'd take turns moving around, this thing around there. But there just wasn't any like it is today. It's hard to describe it, really.
Where did you go to school?
I went to the first school of this community was in the Methodist Church that I spoke of in New Hope, this northeast of the New Hope Cemetery that exists today.
Which is right off of Parsons
They went to
Avenue.
school, yes. They went to school in the church. The next church was built on Parsons Avenue at the place where Wood's
Funeral home.
was until it was torn down. And this was built in 1903. So that's where I went to school. And I went to school up until I don't remember when it was, but how long I went there. But sometime after we arrived there, my father and Mr. McIntosh, Ralph McIntosh, he was at that time was postmaster here in Brandon, decided that well, I have a bunch of little schools all scattered all around. Why not try and get a consolidated school here? And they were really the ones that were behind all of this movement. And eventually they succeeded. Then that school was built, where, of course I can show you better on the map, I will a little later. But that school was built just south of where Victoria's house was built, at the corner of Knights and in Victoria Street.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the land was given to the school by my grandmother. My grandfather had passed on, and the 40 acres when the town was named Brandon, they had the town surveyed and they laid out some streets, and the area of these streets amounted to 40 acres of property. And then eventually that was deeded to the county in a formal, well, they went into Tampa. I have copies of the deeds. I have copies of all of the deeds, just about, that originated from way back, some of them back in 1855, 1860, and along in there. And Mr. Dennis Paul has provided us with every transaction, all the property that changes hands from the very beginning up until the town was named.
Tell us about how some of the streets were named after your relatives.
Well, I don't really know because they were all named when we got here.
Mm-hmm.
But Victoria obviously was named after Victoria Bradman.
Right.
Sadie Street was named after, incidentally, Sadie, they had 14 boys between the two marriages and only one girl.
And that was Sadie.
And that was Sadie. What street named after Sadie, that's understandable. And there's some other streets here, but now Moon, I don't know how it got its name. Whether it was I don't know what it was named then. I really don't know.
Do you know any other stories about any of the street names, how they got named?
No, I don't. That's all I know about that. Well, Parsons, they were prominent people here at that time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the families living here at that time, and that's probably where how Parsons got its name, I'm sure. But you see, when you're growing up, when you're a young fellow, you're not too much interested in the community. It's a everyday affair for you.
Mm-hmm. Your grandmother, Victoria, she was one of the first postmistresses, wasn't she?
That's right, and she had the post office in her home. And then it was moved to, now this hub of the universe of Brandon was, that's going to bear some really digging into to find out which is first. But I had an uncle who was named Varn. His name was Hugh Varn, and strange as it may seem, poor Hugh, from all the history books and all, just never existed. Yet he was a prominent part in the early days of Brandon, in the community, because he lived down in Bloomingdale, but he built a packing house, an orange packing house, between Knights and Moon, on the siding there, on the south side of the railroad. There was a strip land there, and for several years, he gave during orange season, we gave work to people in the community. So, and later on, he had a store here in Brandon too.
Where was
I'm
this store?
talking about like 1890, 92, 93, 94, 95. Then there was a people called Modulin, M-O-D-L-I-N. They had a store here. I was talking to Bob Summerall about a week ago, and he thinks when he was about 16, he overheard a conversation when the Morgans came from Virginia here and tried to buy that store. But eventually they didn't buy it. And then that's another story. Now, just which came first, I can't say. But like I mentioned, if we could have a little get-together from some of the people in the community, and including the Morgans and everybody like that, and tell us when it is, so we can put the dates on there, so we'll have something to go by. Because that's really what we need, is dates. Photographs and things that were taken, you turn them over blank.
Tell us about your uncle who built the home there on New Hope Road, or now what is known as, or Hopewell. Was it Hopewell?
Hopewell, it was
Hopewell Road,
Hopewell
which
Road.
is now State Road 60.
State Road 60. That was James Henry.
That was your uncle?
Uh, Yes, that would be my uncle, wouldn't it?
Mhm.
Because,
He was brother to your father.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. But James Henry, half-brother, James Henry was from
First.
John Brandon's first wife.
Okay, right.
My father was from
The second.
John Brandon's second wife.
Right.
That would be half-brothers. Well, he wasn't very old. He was only about 20 years old or so when John Brandon left here to go to Fort Meade. I don't know where or how these people got the money, but you can look in these transactions, you can find where John Brandon for $1,500 bought property from so-and-so, Mr. Birch and things like that, and you can see, I don't know how they got money, really, I don't. But James Henry somehow had to get money because while John Brandon was away in Fort
Meade.
Fort Meade, he built this home. Now it cost him about $3,500. And where did he get the money from? How did he make it? The only way they had was orange groves. They had produce, what they could raise and grow, unless they had money when they came here. That's the only thing I can. That's John's father left him. I think he left him some money, but that's the only way I know, because certainly it must have cost a lot for this caravan to come from Mississippi down here. On the road about a couple of years, a year and a half or more. Certainly they must have had there. So James Henry then built this and married. Of course, that home, I think, was sort of a wedding present for his wife. He married Johanna Kovacevic, and they live there now. I have a cousin, Clara Brandon Kruger. She was the Brandon historian, and I have about a 12 or 13 typewritten page of Clara Brandon's history. Clara Brandon actually knew John Brandon, and she is her picture and her description of her, and as well as some other Brandons, are in the volume 3 of the Pioneer Florida by D.B. McKay. Volume 3 is just photographs, whole-size pictures of pioneer Floridians, and she's in there. And she was a well-educated person. She was a graduate of the University of Florida. She went to Europe to study art. She studied under some well-known artists, I don't remember now, but she realized and did it at her expense to get the origin of the family that originated in England. That's where John's father or grandfather actually came from. He was from England.
That's right. Tell us a little bit about that, because you told me about that once before.
Well, Henry VIII had a sister, and Charles Brandon was a personal friend of Henry VIII. And Charles Brandon and what's her name? Did I just tell you what her name was? Sister?
No.
Marie, no. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can come up with that real quick. Well, anyway, it was his sister. I'll think of it in a minute. They grew up together, but she had been promised to the King of France. And when the King of France, when his wife passed away, then they got married. And when the death of the King of France, she the king of England, Henry VIII, sent Charles Brandon to France to bring her back. And she said, well, I'm not coming back, because they were sweethearts. And she said, on the spot, if you'll marry me, I'll come back. So they were married in France, and then they came back. And then Henry VIII it took her dowry away from her, it took all the rights of the monarch of the throne or whatever away from her for about a year, because he wanted to marry to somebody, I think somebody in Spain. But anyway, that's where Charles Brandon, her name was Mary. She was Mary Tudor, Queen of France at one time. That's when when the marriage was preordained, or they made marriages those days like that. So, and then they had one child. Let's see, I don't remember when they left, but they emigrated to Scotland first. By the name William Brandon was the guy that went from that. I think that was a son of Mary and Charles. And they came by way of Scotland, and then they came from Scotland. They stayed there for a while. There's several towns and one bay named like Brandon Bay. There's Brandon Mountains there in Scotland, named after this fellow Edmund, and he emigrated to the United States on the James River. And they settled there, and they built a mansion there. And according to one of the colleges there, this was the first official people that owned land in the United States. It was when they came over from England. I have all of the information as to what this was a well-known college. I can't call the name offhand, but it tells in one of their quarterlies, they made some surveys on this thing, and it's there. So, and then later on, they sold it to President Harris. I think it was Harrison. I guess it was President Harrison. He bought that estate, and then they scattered. Some of them went west. Some of them went. One of them came south. And John Brandon was one that came south.
Ended up in Brandon.
Ended up in Brandon.
That's quite a history. Came to Brandon. How much acreage did he homestead?
Well, they were homesteaded in sections of land. I think each section consisted of 160 acres. So he must have homesteaded about 3 or 4 of these sections, because he had 500 acres by homesteading. Now, it cost him, let's see, 75 cents an acre. That's the tax that he had to pay to get it. And they had to stay on the land like 5 years and supposed to improve it. Then he bought other acreage that added up to about 600 acres or more from different people. Like I just mentioned a while ago, he bought for $1,500. He bought like 250 acres from Mr. Birch or somebody like that. So all told, when he passed away, I think that, of course, they had given acreages to the schools, to the churches in Brandon and things like that. And when Victoria, there's only about a couple hundred acres left. At that time now, my father's half-brother, Isaac Brandon, was the big landholder in Brandon, and he owned property that is west of King Avenue. He owned exactly 199 1/4 acres, and that's where Isaac lived. So when my father came here, of course, all this land did pass into his hands, and he sold land right here. I know one family, the Dempsey's, bought land for $5 an acre, which is right now in the heart of Brandon. And they gave, I think it was 10 acres to the school, And then I remember that there was about 2 more acres that was sort of in front of the school, but it impeded people coming in. When they came in the street, they had to come in and then go like this to get to the school. So finally they decided that was kind of a nuisance, so they finally gave that a little bit to him. Of course, I was here at that time, and I do remember some of these things, but basically these transactions that I mentioned are all the deeds, all the property, dates and times, and the amounts of money involved is all recorded in these certain books, like, township number so-and-so, plat number so-and-so, page number so-and-so.
And all that acreage is no longer with the Brandon family.
No, it's no longer. No, it isn't. It's just terrible. As a matter of fact, at one time, I had an uncle, another one of my uncles was Bert Brandon, and he retired as a major from the Army. And Uncle Bert tried to get us to get together one time, after it passed out of the Brandon family, to get it back. But at that time, the amount of money involved was too much. We just couldn't come up with enough money there. But we did want to get that back one time, get it back in the Brandon family. But we didn't.
Your grandfather John and a whole lot of other members of your family are buried in the Brandon family cemetery.
Yes, they're.
Where is that located?
That's at the corner of Pinewood and 60.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised. All of their, even Martha Carson, John Brandon's first wife, her mother and father are buried there even. Sam Carson, and I forget the name of the other one, but they're buried there. John is buried there, Victoria is buried there, James Henry is buried there, Isaac is buried there, Martha is buried there, Mary is buried there, Isaac Brandon's wife, Amanda, is buried there. All the Martin's family is there because Isaac's wife was a Martin at one time, so they're in there. And matter of fact, my wife is there. She passed away about 8 years ago, and she is buried there. But now, my mother and father are not buried there. They're buried over in the New Hope Cemetery. Clara Brandon, there's Clara again. I'll show you a picture before we leave here. Clara, it happened this way. My father and I were the ones that were, on certain days of the week, we'd have to go over what's now the cemetery at Pinewood and 60 and dig up the sand spurs and clean things up. Well, one day we were over there, and I was digging, I guess, and I saw this plant or something there. I didn't pay much attention to it, but when Martha and Mary came there the next day, they said, "Where is this? Why are you digging this up?" And they said, "This is a little family squabble, and see." So I guess it got to the point where it was a little unpleasant for my folks to go there, my mother and father. So Clara then secured a place for them over at the New Hope Cemetery. It's under the auspices of the Methodist Church right now. Mm-hmm. And she's buried there. And there's some other Brandons there. There were several John Brandons that came along after that.
Tell us more about some of the other people in the family from back in the early days. You know, like James Henry, and
yes, well,
tell us about them in the home. Describe the home there. Did you ever get to go in it and everything?
No, I never did, other than...
Oh, I know what I want you to describe Victoria's home.
Oh, all right. Let's see. It was made out of virgin pine. Now, that virgin pine means that the tree had never been tapped for turpentine. It had all the good things that makes wood endure down through the years in it. And the ceilings were 14 feet high, enormous high ceilings. Like I said, there's about 8 rooms in there. And when we were there, when we came there in 1912, the building had gone down some. It needed a new roof, of course, which my father provided and things like that. Then, I remember my father telling me a story that he said, son, there was a brick mason, a man that built chimneys in those days. And he said, son, his name was Mr. Libby, I remember that. He said, son, I want you to look at this, the hearth of the fireplace. He said, I'm going to build this a quarter. Eventually it'll probably settle and then it will be level. But you know, 25 years later, that was still a quarter of an inch above the floor. But they had this, as I mentioned before, they had the fireplace in 2 of the bedrooms upstairs, and the ceilings, as I say, were very tall, and they were all natural finish. Now, they didn't paint it, the inside of it, they just left it natural wood, real beautiful. Had a real large dining room, like a formal dining room. This clock that you see hanging right in here was a present that John Brandon gave his wife, Victoria, when this home was built. When they were married, when they came up here and built the home, then there's some kind of a wedding present, and he gave that clock, and I have it there. It's in good running order. I just forgot to wind it today.
Do you have to wind it every day?
No, it runs for 7 days.
Uh-huh.
No, it runs for 7 days. Then it had a large front porch and had a big swing, an old-fashioned swing attached to it, and that's where the family would gather on Sundays. All their sons came from all around. Some came from Fort Meade, some came from Clearwater, some came from in the Valrico area. And what you did on Sundays wasn't any place to go. The mountains, of course there was in Clearwater and St. Pete, but that was a habit, a ritual, let's say. On Sundays we all gathered there. And my grandmother, of course, I was her errand boy, you might say. I'd take her pension and run it down to the post office and cash it. They'd give me the money and I'd bring it back. But let's see what I was going to say.
Was there a big kitchen in the house?
Oh yes, I was going to say there was a big kitchen in there. Let me tell you a story. One time, you know, we had to go to Tampa to get ice. There wasn't any ice out here then, and we'd go into Tampa to get ice and put it on the running board of the car, bring it out here to make ice cream. My dad was nuts on ice cream. He just loved ice cream. Oh, and we had made this ice cream was made out of nice fresh cream. You'd skim it off the, gotten milk the cow, and the next day or two there'd be cream this thick on top of there, and skim it off, and that's what this thing was made out of. And I had to churn it. Well, somehow or another, listen, if there's somehow or another, you know what Octagon soap looks like? Somehow or another, a piece of Octagon soap got into the inside of this thing, and nobody knew it till it was all frozen.
Oh no.
You had to throw the whole thing away.
That's like good old lye soap, isn't it?
Right.
Yes.
It had a nice back porch, and it had a well. There wasn't any running water there until we came there, and then we put a well down, and we put machinery to put water into the house. And they had a chick sails out in the back, you know, 2-holer. Where you went, see?
Uh-huh.
And
No indoor plumbing.
no indoor plumbing whatsoever. And my grandmother used to tell a lot of stories, and some of them were very interesting. One of them of which is worth repeating, I think. She said that shortly after they came there, you know, there were a lot of Indians. A lot of Indians in Florida, a lot of Indians around here. As a matter of fact, Lake Notasassa was all kind of tribes of Indians around here. They gathered this day in front of this house at her home there in Brandon, under an oak tree out in front. And this was going on all day, and the Indians, the crowds were getting larger and larger. And grandmother apparently was getting more concerned about it all the time. Well, it so happened that that afternoon, a storm came up, and during this storm, lightning struck this tree. Well, that scared the Indians to death. And they all took off but one who was stunned. This Indian was stunned. So so grandmother said they went out and got him and brought him in. Actually, he was just stunned. They threw some water on him. Well, they did something, whatever they knew to do at that time. pretty soon he came to. It turned out that he was the chief's son. So they never had any more problems from Indians. They thought, hey, these people are supernatural. They can bring a person back from, he was dead, now he's alive, see? So they had no problem there. Then, when we first came here in 1912, my father grew up with one of the slaves. When John Brandon married Victoria Marie Seward Barn Brandon, she had slaves. But her husband, of course, was killed in the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And then, when she moved to Brandon, she left some of them there, but she brought some slaves with her. But the only male one was a boy about my father's age. And they almost grew up together. And he's credited with saving my father's life. Right in the back of the first school that was built in Brandon, John Brandon, and they started into Tampa one time in a wagon to get supplies. On the way back was this big sinkhole right there. Eventually it filled with water. And my grandmother says that my father fell in there one day, and Varn was his name. See, the slaves took the name of the family name. And Andrew jumped in and pulled my dad out. Well, of course, when my father left here, when he was sent away by his mother to school, it was like 40 years before he got back here. And one of the first persons he wanted to see was Andrew Varn. He asked my grandmother, and she said yes. When we freed him, he wouldn't leave, and so we bought him a couple of acres of land over at Settler and built him a home and put him over there. My dad said, well, I'm going to see him. This is about the second or third Sunday after we arrived here in Brandon. So my mother and my father and I, we got in this car and we went over, and these were just sand roads, right through trees and things. There were no markers or anything. We knew about where it was. We arrived at this place where Andrew lived. He saw my father, and he came running and put his arms around my father. And tears came into his eyes. He was so happy to see my father, because they were really, and of course I was standing there, and this thing was, I was standing there with my mouth open. Here's a nigger coming up and putting his arms around my dad, see? It just didn't add up to some things I'd heard, you know, and done. But anyway, so we went in and sat. My mother wouldn't get out of the car. But we went in and sat on Andrew Barnes' porch, and he and my father talked about old times and things, and Andrew said, was telling my father, you know, he says, he called him Brother Mark, he said, you know, the coming generation of niggers are no good. He said, they read the funny papers on Sunday and they won't work but 10 hours a day. So I remember that very well. She told a lot of stories that it's too bad that somebody wasn't more interested in making note of all these little things. But she, in her later years, now she became an invalid.
Who's that?
That's Victoria, my
Victoria,
grandmother. And like I say, I was an errand boy. I did all her shopping, and every time when she'd get her pension and I'd run down to the store and cash it, she'd tell me, Mark, you bring home 2 boxes of, there was a biscuit, a sweet biscuit out then called Social Tea biscuits. And I'd bring home a couple of boxes of Social Tea biscuits. My goodness, how she loved those Social Tea biscuits. That was the name of them. But I've got a little picture here. This is too small to show, but this is the only picture that I have of her that in her reclining years. Now they built her so she could get
Can you
around.
get it?
They built her a wooden walker, and she got in that, and she's the other lady sitting right in this corner. And my mother is in that picture, and I'm in that picture. The man is Bob Martin, married to Sadie. That's Sadie Brandon Martin right there, the other lady over there. And this was from a picture that was very, very faded, and it was real hard to reproduce. My friend John Manning worked on this thing for a long time to get it as good as it is now. Anyway, but I was married in September the 26th, 1926, and lived. Well, let me back up a little bit. In the meantime, before Victoria passed away, my mother had sort of remodeled the house upstairs because there was no place for the teachers. There was no place. They couldn't get teachers to come here because there was no facilities, no motels, there's nothing, no hotels, nothing. So the people in the community took them in as boarders. And my mother fixed up 2 of these rooms upstairs, and with 2 teachers they lived in a room together. So there was 4 teachers at one time. But finally my mother said to my dad, I think what she said was, look, I want a house, a home all of my own. So then he built a home just directly west of the old Victoria's home, and it got painted brown for some reason, and that was known in the community as a little brown house. Well, where's Mark? Well, he lives in the little brown house. That's how it was described. Then that's where my wife and I lived. But see, Victoria passed away 3 months. She passed away in December, and I was married in November. So
Was that house that you first lived in still there?
no,
No.
the house we lived in was Victoria's house. Now I'll tell you,
I mean, the little brown
oh
house.
yes, that's still there.
Uh-huh.
It's been added on to a number of times, but this lady was Dr. Grable's, one of her nurses. These nurses bought it. Anyway, let's see. What was I talking about?
Victoria passing away just as you
Oh,
got
yeah.
married.
Yeah. Well, of course, if she'd have lived a little longer, being able to take shorthand, things like that, she could have got so much information preserved. But,
Do you remember any more stories your grandmother told you that you find humorous or interesting?
Well, no, not really. That's about the one about the kerosene, and the one about the Indians. It was about all I can think of right now.
The family that you were talking about, the Varn family, the
Yes.
black people, they're still in the community, aren't
Oh,
they,
yes.
in the area?
Hazel and Bernie Orsley, Orsley. It just turned out that there was an article in the paper, in the Tribune, about them one time, and I called that number. They gave a phone number, and I called that number. And she said, I told her who I was, and she told me on the phone she was trying to locate her grandfather, that a house had burned and all the records had burned in the house. So I said, well, I can give you a lot of information, because if your grandfather was Andrew Varn, then I can describe him to you in all detail, and I did. And as a matter of fact, they came here to visit me. They've been here to visit me a couple of times, the Orsleys.
Hazel Orsley is Andrew Varn's granddaughter.
That's right.
Oh, that's interesting.
And her husband is Bernie. Now they're very well educated, and they're really nice people.
I believe they're members of the Brandon Historical Society.
Yes, they're right.
Where did your food and clothes come from?
Oh boy, my mother had to sew. That's a good question, because I know that I had to be awfully careful about what I wore. And if I tore anything, why, that was too bad. But I remember making a little piece out of wire that was in the form of a U. And my mother and my grandmother, now I had 2 grandmothers. Incidentally, my mother's mother, my grandmother on her Tedder side, came with us when we came to Brandon, and her name was Elizabeth Tedder. And she passed away in the little brown house. But, see, this is kind of disjointed, but one thing makes me think of something else, and I have a little time getting back to what I was talking about. But as far as tales goes, that's about it, I guess.
What about your, did you have a garden?
Oh, yes, we farmed, that was one of the means. Now, that's a good question, because I can tell you something about that. My Ularn had a cane mill. Now, this was a thing that revolved around with two big rollers, and you put the cane in like this, and the juice went into the thing, and I got a little story about that too. So, but you needed a big heavy kettle, and that was it in a, well, it had a place where you could put firewood under it and boil it, and you skimmed it and boiled it and skimmed it, you know, and eventually you made syrup out of it. My father borrowed this mill and brought it up to Brandon. In the meantime, we had planted about 20 acres of Japanese cane. But my father, it was pulled by a mule. It went around and around and around, a long wooden beam on top of this mill, this thing that went revolved. But my father put a gasoline engine on it. He brought a gasoline engine. That was the engine that made the lights, you see. And we squeezed cane juice. When it got time, everybody was saying, "Well, Brother Mark, where's your kettle? You can't have a kettle." And my father says, "Well, I'm going to make one out of wood." And they said, "Well, you can't make one out of wood. Wood will burn." So what my father did was make a wall 3 feet high, larger than, and then he went and bought some Cypress 2x12s, made a frame, put a piece of sheet iron, he tacked a piece of sheet iron on the bottom of that, and sat that over this frame that had made out of brick and things. And we made syrup. We put up syrup. We had our own label. We had labels made. We put labels up. And my mother paid a lot of, she traded that, she took it to the store. And let me tell you about the store. When you went to buy food, you didn't have money. You didn't need money. Every person in the community had a book. And when you went some groceries, they'd write in the book bread, 5 cents, 50, you know, that's the thing. It had a little carbon in it. They'd give you a copy and they'd keep it. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes the bills would go up to $300 and $400. But they knew eventually they were going to get paid. So you go in the store to buy groceries, you didn't have any money, it didn't matter. You just tell them who you were. They'd make your name, write your slip down, and that's how you...
So your mother bartered then?
Bartered, yeah.
Bartered her cane syrup.
And then she used the money that she got from, and she was a good cook, really. And she was a seamstress. She knitted a lot. You asked me about
Clothes
and things. And they made their own clothes, just where they bought the material. In some manner, the material was available in stores, and they bought the material and made them. My mother was a real seamstress, a real special seamstress.
Did you raise any animals for food?
Well, we had hogs, we had horses. We had to have horses. My father's brother had a horse. My father's brother Lovey was postmaster and station agent in the town of Valrico. And he had a store and a post office in the place there. People couldn't pay him, so he took things in on trade, like this great big beautiful horse. We needed a horse. So I went to Valrico and drove the horse back to Brandon. So we hitched him up and I was plowing. We hitched the horse up and I was plowing. And he'd back up, you know, hook the traces, then I'd have to do it again. See, my dad said, "Son, go and get the car. I'm going to give that horse enough of backing up." So I got the car. He unhitched the horse from the plow, tried the single tree, I guess it is, whatever it is, the 2 chains come back, tied that to the car. And I said, "Let's drive real slow, son." That was pulling the horse backwards. And we went around a little ways there. And you know, to this day, that horse never went. When I'd pull on the reins to get him to gee or haw, at first he'd just back up. But he never did. That cured him. He got enough backing up. He never did back up anymore.
Did you have any cattle? You know, cows and
No,
for milk?
no.
So-
Well, we had milk cows. Oh,
Uh-huh.
yes, we had milk cows.
What did you eat? Did you have beef pretty regular? Did you have to buy that at
Well,
the
they
store?
hunted. They had venison. We had meat. Deer were no problem.
So you ate lots of venison rather
Right,
than beef.
And they butchered, they killed hogs and things. And
Have chickens for fresh eggs?
Chicken, oh God, it was I fell here with a hatchet to take the chicken, cut the chicken's head off. That was my job. Oh, brother, I tell you, I didn't like that. Because the dumb animal would get up and run off with the head cut off. It just looked terrible to me. But that, I had to do that.
Where did you go? Did you go to Ybor City or Tampa for other things you had to buy that you
Yes,
couldn't get?
yes, that's right. Anything that we couldn't get in Brandon, and
How often would you go?
about once a week.
Mm-hmm.
Staples we could get here, but notions, other things that were not available here.
Like, for instance?
Well, like toothpaste, and toothbrushes, and
Mm-hmm.
combs and brushes, and some clothes
Mm-hmm.
were available in stores then, after 1912. And then,
How did you get there? How'd you get to Tampa?
well, my father had 2 automobiles. He bought me when I was 14 years old, he bought me a Metz automobile. Now this wasn't running, but I had a lot of fun. I tore the thing apart, you know, as a kid, just tore it apart, tampering with it to see what it was made like. But we had a Dodge and a Franklin. That car had a wooden chassis, the Franklin did. But the Dodge car was the one we used the most because, and we would drive in, I remember taking my mother when she was going to furnish these rooms. She went to Tampa to buy linoleum. And she bought it from a young linoleum place that sold that kind of material. And their last names were Young. And that store is still standing, and it's still under the name of Young's today. And this was like maybe 1915 or 16 when we went in there. We'd go in and buy these things. But you didn't need you didn't have to have a driver's license. And I was driving in the Tampa when I was 10 years old. I used to take my mother in like that.
Didn't have much traffic on the road there, did you?
None whatsoever. Hardly. If you would meet 2 cars going between here and Tampa, the ruts were deep. Somebody had to give. Maybe you'd have to back up and pull off on the side of the road and let the car by. Well, shoot, when we came here in 1960 from the Canal Zone, Michelle, you couldn't even go. If you went from here to Brandon, maybe you would pass 1 or 2 automobiles. See, that's how it was.
I remember you told me once about this water down here on Kings Avenue.
Oh gosh,
Tell
yes.
us about that.
This same grits mill, not grits mill, but this same cane mill that I'm telling you about. And after my dad got it hooked up, I would just stand there and feed the cane in it like this, and the students were going, oh, how I love to drink that cane juice. But he got time to return this mill. And I was returning the mill to my father's brother, Hugh Marn, which is all the books, even the Pioneer, Florida, it's just as if Hugh Marn never existed. They don't even acknowledge he was even born.
My goodness.
And I don't understand it.
Does he have any relatives, descendants? Descendants now?
Listen, Victoria was his mother when she was a barn.
Right, but I mean, does he have any
Oh, yes,
descendants now?
there's some, he left some descendants from Plant City. He did move from here to Plant City. Getting back to returning this mill. So we hitched the wagon up and we put this mill in there, we loaded, and a young fellow by the name of Glenn Martin was with me, and it was our duty to return this grits mill, cane mill, back to Hugh's place. Well, the dirt road, you know where the Kings live up here, this on King Avenue, this large house up there.
Large gray house
Large
on
gray house,
Kings
yes.
Avenue.
That's right. And that little lake goes on down close to Brandon. But when you go by there sometime, you look around and you'll see that there's a vast area in which there are no trees. Now that wasn't cleared. The lake was very large at one time. But it apparently rained sometime and the water was real deep. As a matter of fact, it was right up to almost to the horse's stomach, and we got right out in there. Although we were sure we were on the road, we couldn't see, of course. But he stopped, wouldn't go. Well, Glenn, unbeknownst to his people, his mother and father, was smoking occasionally, see. So he got some and we were sitting on a newspaper or something on the seat, this wagon seat, so he got this newspaper out, and he got out and waded in the water up to his waist just about, rolled up this newspaper in a roll and lit it, stuck it under the horse's stomach, and we took off. We got out of there all right.
So that water at one time actually crossed Kings Avenue.
Yes, and you know, if it continues to rain like it's been in the past, it's going to be up there again. People just don't believe it.
There's a pond behind some of those houses there. Do you think that water would ever kind of touch
It
me?
might do that.
They'd have to go through some houses there to do it, wouldn't it?
Right. Well,
Show us the stuff
Oh.
your grandfather made, the
well,
things
yes,
your grandfather made.
this, let me hold this up so you can see it a little better. This was the board in which they made bread on their trip from Mississippi down to Florida. And this was a rolling pin. After they made the dough and kneaded it in here, then they rolled it down on, I don't have the board that they rolled it down on, but this was a rolling pin. Now this was all made by grandfather John Brandon.
Uh-huh.
And here's,
And what year was that about, John, Mark?
well, that's, let me see, let me get that. That was 1857.
Mm.
Well, it was about 56 when they left Mississippi. This was a plane that was used by John Brandon. In one of the planes, rather, I'm sure he had he had to have a lot of other influence because they made metal hooks. See, they could make the wooden wheel, but the wheel wouldn't last. They had to then band that, and he had to be also a blacksmith. He had to weld the two ends of that big band that went around the wheel together. So he was a wheelwright, and you name it.
Mm-hmm.
You had to be to exist. But anyway, this was one of the planes that was used there. And this is a chair that was made by John Brandon, and it was reclaimed by my wife, Lil Brandon. About 1927, she went up in the attic and she found this, among other things. And
Yeah.
oh, all right. This seat, well, first let me tell you, this chair is 108 years old, and this is made out of a deerskin hide that John Brandon shot. And as you can see, if you can see that, the rawhide that he used, and all of this is the original, just like this. And I say, Lil, my wife, saw this up there, and she asked Grandmother Cheryl for it, and of course she gave it to her, and it hasn't been touched since then. This is the original finish from about 1927. It's on there, and you know, if you look at this chair, I don't know. I'm sort of a woodworker myself. For many years I've been involved in making wooden products. I don't know how it would be hard for me to make this with tools. The way this is put together. Now you got to remember, they had to take a square piece of wood and take a plane and just keep on planing until they got this round. They didn't. If he had a lathe, now I don't know, he could have made it on a lathe, but I'm not sure whether they had it. I doubt seriously if they had a lathe at that time. So it's well made, and it's holding up real well, and I don't let anybody in his house ever sit in it. So that's what I have of that's really personal of the John Brandon family that my grandfather made, and I'm going to try to make sure it stays in the Brandon family. That's for sure.
How many of your age level are still alive?
Okay, I have a first cousin, James Davis Brandon. He lives in Tampa. I have a first cousin, Louise Brandon Caldwell. She had two sons. They both went to West Point. I have a first cousin, Josephine Brandon Morality. Now that's the end of it. That's it.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
No, I was the only child. I had no brothers or sisters.
And how many children do you have, Mark?
Four.
Four.
I have 4 children.
Mm-hmm.
I have a Mark, he passed the name on to him, Mark, so we had to call him Mark the Third. And then there's my daughter Mary Ann, son Robert, and a son Michael.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
13 here and 2 in Texas.
Any great-grandchildren yet?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
But the oldest granddaughter was married about a year and a half ago, so we're sort of thinking one of these days I'll
Be a great-granddad.
great-grandfather. That'd be something, wouldn't it?
What is your fondest memory of growing up in Brandon? Do you have one that's especially special to you?
Well, I think I sort of loved my grandmother. I don't know, she seemed to put up with me more, and I became very fond of her. And outside of something else, getting in with family, I think my grandmother, I really thought an awful lot of her. And my memories were very pleasant with her, always.
That's good. What is the biggest change you've seen in Brandon since you were a young boy living with in your grandmother's house to now?
Advent of the automobile. Really. Well, you see, Brandon moved away. About 1920, when Hopewell Road, Hopewell Road became 60, and it had some kind of a surface on it that you could drive automobiles on. The people just migrated. They just went to close the businesses up and move down to Highway 60. My Sadie's husband, Bob Martin, he had a big store right on the corner of the Knights and 60. Then there were the sawmill eventually came to Brandon. The Coles brought a sawmill into here, and we would go to like a Cypress. There was so much land here. No one knew who owned it, but we'd go down what they call the Bayhead. That's a big area, about maybe 10 or 15 acres, marshy, but nothing but cypress trees would go there. We'd go there and cut a cypress tree down, take it to Cole's sawmill and have them saw it up. I know one summer, George Martin was working in the packing house there, in Hugh Barnes' packing house, and he built 3 boats, one for my father, one for him, and one for someone else. My father put a little engine in it, and Robert Summeralls and I, and my father, we made a trip from the mouth of the Alafai River to Casey's Pass. That's down below Sarasota in this little boat. On a little trip. We were going about a week or so, I guess. But that's the changes. As I say, it's just. I think the beauty of the land in and around Brandon, and you know, if you get up in a plane, there's so many lakes and things around here, attracted people to this area. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons, and because, let's say it's an unincorporated town, that's getting away from big taxes and things in the cities, and that brought people in here, plus the good schools, churches, hospitals eventually. And, but I think probably the automobile had about as much to do with it as anything. I bought a car once. I worked a little bit for a post office here at Tampa after I graduated from high school, which was Old Hillsborough High School in 1924 in Tampa. A car, a complete automobile for $350, a Model T Ford coupe, just 2 people, $350. I took delivery of it in Ybor City. There was a Ford agency there on 7th Avenue by the name of Holsinger. He's still, some of his family is still in the automobile business today. But the car was on a boat, came into the estuary on 13th Street. I went down and saw the crane pick it off and sit it down. I saw the man come and crank it up and drive it down and then prepare it for me. $350.
Where did it come from?
Detroit.
Uh-huh.
They shipped it to, it came down by ocean freight.
Mm-hmm.
It came on the ship. So, But then we left here in 1917. At that time, the Curtiss Airplane Factory in Buffalo, New York, were making warplanes to be used against Germany. But they were having problems. They were having problems with the machine gun was mounted on the cockpit of the plane to aim and it fired through the propeller. And they were having problems with this device to make it fire regardless of the speed of the propeller, where the propeller wasn't. So my father, as I mentioned, when he was in Savannah, he went to school. He learned about the internal combustion engine. And they wrote this school for people who were knowledgeable about mechanical ability. And they sent my father a cable. My father was living here in Brandon at that time. They sent my father a cable offering him employment at Curtiss Airplane Factory in Buffalo, New York. So we sold out. We sold everything we had. Of course, didn't sell the houses, but we sold livestock or whatever. We had hogs or whatever, some horses and wagons and stuff. And we went to Buffalo, New York, and we stayed there until the duration of the war, which was about a year. We were there about a year and a half. Then we returned to Brandon. Of course, he was no longer employed or needed when the war was over because there was no more planes being manufactured. So, but during that period now, Louise Martin Caldwell and Aunt Sadie took care of Victoria. And Louise has a lot of memories and a lot of things written down that grandmother, well, when we were here, see, she was a Cheryl. This is something. Marie, Seward, Victoria, Marie, Seward, Varn, Brandon, Cheryl. And of course, we never knew about Mr. Sherrill. There's nothing, I never heard anyone in the family mention his name. Of course, I wasn't interested. They could have talked about it a lot and I would have never known it. But Grandmother Sherrill never mentioned it. And apparently, he left.
Now, who is this?
Cheryl, Mr. Sherrill. She married a Cheryl.
Victoria did?
Victoria married Cheryl.
After John Brandon.
Yeah, after John Brandon died, and after she was involved in the community and everything. And he was in the Spanish-American War. And this pension that I speak of was $85 a year. That was the pension that she was getting. So much a month divided, the monthly pay was $9 or $10 a month. That's how she got this pension on the fact that he was a veteran, and she was a widow. I mean, when he died or something, whatever. Anyway, how would you go about getting those?
How much did those cookies cost that you'd go buy when
they were a dime,
a
10
dime?
cents. And you could go in Dan Galvin's store and get a handful of little colored balls of candy, hard candy, different colors. A penny. I have a book here. Let's see. Now this isn't it, but I don't think it's it. No, this. Yeah, this is a ledger. This was a book kept by Martha Brandon, who was lived with Isaac Brandon's, one of Isaac Brandon's daughter, on 60. All of this big subdivision down there eventually passed into the hands of Martha and Mary sold it. But she goes back in here and she wrote down everything that she did. She was really something. Like this pieces in there, pages in here where she bought a toothbrush for 5 cents. She'd make an entry in here. And when they sold their fruit, like she'd get $900 that year for the fruit on the grove. And what she did with it, the money that she banked and all. It's just something that I sort of treasure because it was part of their life. And but I'll tell you.
Were there any banks in Brandon?
No banks.
How did you do any kind of money transaction?
Talking about banks now, when my father moved to Callahan, he started a bank. That was called the Callahan State Bank. And so he knew about banks, but there never was a bank that I know of in Brandon. The first bank that I know of in Brandon was the Brandon State Bank, and that was on Parsons Avenue. It's now, I'm not sure, we got here in 1960. I don't know whether the bank was here before that. I think it was a few years before that.
Yeah. But how did you transact any money back? Or you didn't have to worry about much about money?
Well, no, it was all cash. Everything was done in cash.
Even when you bought property?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You had to tell the guy, well, I'll pay you so much a month or something, but the deed was recorded as
Did people keep their money in their homes then?
Yes.
You didn't worry about anybody stealing it or anything? No crimes?
None whatsoever. None. Our nearest neighbor were the Kings, and when my mother and father would go away, they'd send me down to the Kings, and we'd stay there, and when the Kings wanted to go someplace.
They lived on Kings Avenue, didn't they?
That's right, at the corner
Right
of King and Victoria.
Yeah.
The original house has been moved off of where it was. It was right where there's a little vegetable stand or something there now.
Right.
That's where it was at one time, but it's been moved up further east. But it still faces Victoria Street, with a wooden building there. And we'd go there, and she was a wonderful cook. Her name was Susie Bell King. And she'd make these biscuits, and oh boy, tray of biscuits. It was big, had a big family, you know, and a big plate of biscuits in the center, in the middle of the table. And one person would pass it on. I would watch that. I would just hope there'd be some left when it got to me. Because I was sitting mostly right down at the end of the table.
Did you get one?
Oh yeah, if I didn't, she'd go in the kitchen and she'd say, well, let me have the plate, and I'll go back and get some more. If it was empty when it got to me, so. And syrup, oh gosh, and cream and milk and things. And,
butter?
Butter. Of course, we didn't have refrigeration, but what we did, my father built a frame about 4 feet square, in which it was enclosed by cloth. And this cloth was brought up to the top of it. And on the top of this was a large pan of water. And this cloth was in the water. Capillary attraction would bring the water down. It would become damp, rather. And the wind blowing through there would reduce the temperature inside there like 10, 15 degrees. And that's where they kept the buttermilk, and our milk.
And it was cold well water, or cool well water?
No.
No?
No. It was just water out of the pump. What we did was, my father had brought a lot of equipment with him. He brought engines and things when he came down here. And so we put a well down. And then we put a pump on there and an engine on to pump the water. Then we bought from the Brookers, who were here in the business of making water tanks. And we got 4 poles that were 30 feet high. Oh, I got a story to tell you. We got these poles about 30 feet high, and we put this 2,500-gallon water tank up there. Well, when the Brookers came to put this tank up, I wondered as a kid, how in the world they were going to get it up there. But they laid rope out along the ground, and they rolled this tank up there, and the rope was tied to the top of this base up there, but there was no railing around it. Now, there was a hole in the center of this platform up there, and there was a hole in the center of the tank that was up there. When they got the tank up there and turned it over, Lot and his father were the 2 men up there working at it, because they were the ones that built the tank, and they had to install it. This hole in the tank had to jive with the hole in the base. Well, the elder Brooker had been even inside these tanks so long, and riveting and making so much noise that he couldn't hear. His son Lot, well, it was too far on that side, see, so Lot would say, he'd yell to his father. They had a crowbar up there. Over a little more. There was no railing around there. Now they're 30 feet up in the air. and finally, it got to the center, and Lot said, "That's enough, stop." His dad said, "All right, here it comes." "No, don't. All right, here it comes." Until Lot, my father then, realized that Lot was standing on a little place about like this, and he was almost getting ready to get pushed off. My father grabbed the grapefruit off the tree and threw it up he got the elderly Brooker's attention. And then he looked around and saw all the area he was standing on, and then he knew what had happened.
So they got it up there.
So they got it up there. But that's how we got our running water in our homes, was from this large tank up there. And windmills, we didn't need a windmill because we had this engine, gasoline engine, but windmills you could put all around here. And then they used the windmill to pump the water up in this tank so they could have running water.
Did
That's how we got
did
it.
they use the windmills to generate electricity too at all?
No. There was no one here
Not enough
knowledgeable
wind.
enough to have a generator.
Uh-huh.
And the wind wasn't really all that much. You could pump water. It run sometimes during the day, and most of the time maybe it didn't. Or wind come up, it would pump water.
So
But
most people
it could
had
keep
their
up
own
with
windmill.
the supply of water that was in the tank. you see.
Mhm.
Whereas if we got low, we just turned the switch, start the engine. My job to go out and crank the engine up, get it
Mhm.
started. When we were in Buffalo, we went to Niagara Falls almost every Sunday on a streetcar that ran on North Tonawanda Street. It was the car that we went in. There was like 5 cars on it. See, we went to the falls one Sunday. We were up there, and we read about it the next day, but there was an island there called Goat Island, and there's a concrete bridge going from the falls over to Goat Island. And there's a concrete bridge, and it is an archway. Was only about 4 or 5 feet under the water. Well, there were some men working up miles and miles up around the Niagara River on a concrete barge, 2 men. Some way or another, this thing broke loose from its moorings, and the river came down and came down and came down, and finally, from the description in the paper now, we found out about it next Sunday, read it in the paper Monday morning, what happened to it. This barge came down, and the barge was wider than the span of the bridge. But the currents were so, and the rocks, there's enormous big rocks in the river, so that when the barge got close to this arch, the water just turned it around, and it went right under this thing with these 2 men on it, and got right at the brink of the falls and stayed there. It was swinging around like this, ready to go over the brink of the falls any minute. Well, they couldn't get him out. Now, they built an overhead railway out of steel cable. They erected some towers on both sides, on the Goat Island and the mainland. And they got some guy to go out there somehow on this cable, and they got pulling these 2 fellas off of this barge, and so, you know, they were saved that way.
My goodness.
And
boy, they came into Brandon.
all right, you see, my cousin Hugh, originally his home was down in Bloomingdale. He moved into Brandon when the railroad came through and built a store there and stocked it with various things. Well, this cowboy had heard about that, so he came to the store and he asked Mr. Barnes for some chewing tobacco. And Mr. Barnes said, I don't sell chewing tobacco. Cowboy says, well, why don't you? And Mr. Barnes said, well, because it kills people. And the cowboy says, thought about that a while, and he said, well, who'd it kill? And Mr. Barnes says, well, it killed old man Summeralls. He died at the age of 116. Oh, there's one other story now I can remember. One time my grandmother sent me down to the store. I walked around the store. This was one of the early stores, real early. And there was a bunch of people sitting there, and they were all discussing what they were going to do when the world came to an end. Okay. It got on down to one man. And they said, what are you going to do, Uncle So-and-so, when the world comes to an end? And he stopped and thought for a while, and he said, oh, I'm going to Georgia.
Georgia was heaven to him.
Yeah, well, that was, you know, he was here for a long time. And people, I know people today that were